We are going to look at the concept of addition and subtraction of fractions. First, I need to define two things. What are like fractions and what are unlike fractions? Like fractions always have the same denominator. Unlike fractions have different denominators. To add or subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator or the same denominator. To add or subtract like fractions, that means they have the same denominator. What you will do is you will either add or subtract your numerators, keep the denominator, and then completely reduce your fraction. Let's work some examples. In our first problem, we have 1/3 plus 1/3. Well, what we do is we add our numerators. So 1 plus 1 is going to give me 2/3. Okay, you don't have to show that middle step, but that is what you do. You actually add the numerators, but notice you do not add the denominators. You keep the denominator. Look at number 2. We have a subtraction problem that is very similar. 11/12 minus 5/12. 11 minus 5 is 6. And of course, we keep our denominator of 12. Now, 6/12 is actually a fraction that will reduce. I see that 6 goes into both of these. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. And then you can cancel those 6's, and the reduced fraction will be 1/2. On number 3, you have 7/8 plus 3/8. 7 plus 3 will give you 10, and of course you keep that denominator of 8. Now the first problem here is I have an improper fraction, so I must divide 8 into 10, and of course that goes one time, with 2 left over. Now that brings me to the second problem. 2/8 is not fully reduced. 2 goes into itself once, 2 goes into 8 4 times, and so my final answer to the problem in completely reduced form should be 1 1/4. Now that brings me to my fourth example. And right now, we can't do 3/4 plus 2/3 because we have not gotten the rules for unlike fractions. Now that leads me to my next set of rules. Before we can start adding unlike fractions, we need to talk about what I call building up a fraction. Now you'll probably never see that term building up a fraction in your book. You'll probably see it in directions similar to these. Rewrite in the indicated denominator, or rewrite the fraction as an equivalent fractions. But I really like the terminology building up fractions because that is exactly what you're doing. You're building your fraction up to a higher denominator. Now, what I've shown here is the concept is that 1/2 can be written in many forms. You can rewrite 1/2 as 2/4, or you can rewrite 1/2 as 3/6, as 4/8, and so on and so on. Now, let me give you some directions for how to build up a fraction to a higher denominator. The first step is you want to divide your denominator into the desired denominator. So for instance, if you had 5/8 is equal to what over 40? 8 goes into 40 5 times. Now the second step, what you will do is you will take that 5/8 and you will actually build up your fraction. So we will multiply both the numerator and the denominator by that factor to get my denominator to the desired denominator of 40. Now 5 times 5 is 25, and of course 5 times 8 is 40. And now you have your desired fraction with the desired denominator. Now let's practice a little bit. 4 goes into 16 4 times. If we multiply the bottom, we must also multiply the top. What you're actually doing is multiplying by 1, which doesn't change the value. Now, 3 times 4 is 12, and of course 4 times 4 is 16. And so my desired numerator is 12. 15 goes into 75 5 times. If you multiply the bottom, you must multiply the top. 4 times 5 is 20. And so 4/15 is also known as 20 over 75. And 8 goes into 144. That's not one I know off the top of my head, so let's divide it out. Let's see, 8 goes into 14 once. I subtract my 8, bring down my 6, bring down my 4. 8 goes into 64 8 times. And of course that goes evenly. And so I need to multiply the bottom by 18. And if I multiply the bottom, I must multiply the top. Now 18 times 5, 8 times 5 is 40, carry my 4. 5 times 1 is 5, and 4 more is 9. So 5/8 is also 90 over 144. Now we're ready to start looking at the directions for how to add and subtract unlike fractions. First of all fractions must be in a common denominator. So if they're not in a common denominator, our first order of business will be to find the LCD. And then we will build up each fraction into this LCD by multiplying by that factor that you get when you divide the denominators. Now, after you've built up the fractions, you now have like fractions. And we go back to the rules of like fractions, which is you add or subtract numerators, always keep your denominator, and then you fully reduce your answer. Let's work with number 1. The first order of business is to find the LCD. And it looks like my LCD here is 10. Now you can do this one of two ways. You can do it vertically, or you can keep it and do it horizontally. The nice thing about vertical is that you actually see the process of building up your fraction. I need to get that to a denominator of 10. And so 2 goes into 10 5 times. If I multiply the bottom, I must multiply the top. 1 times 5 is 5. So 1/2 has been renamed as 5/10. Then 5 goes into 10 2 times. 3 times 2 is 6. And 3/5 has been renamed as 6/10. And now we are ready to add our numerators. 5 plus 6, of course, gives me 11. And I keep my denominator. Now 11/10 is an improper fraction and it must be reduced. 10 goes into 11 one time with 1 left over. And so my final answer would be 1 1/10. Now we want to look at what happens when we have three fractions, and it's the same process. Our common denominator is 12. This time I'll show you what you would do if you did it horizontally instead of vertically. You do not change the 5/12 because it is in the common denominator. Now, 4 goes into 12 3 times. So you want to multiply that by 3, top and bottom. 3 times 3 is, of course, 9, and 4 times 3 is 12. And then we move to our second fraction. 3 goes into 12 4 times. If you multiply the bottom by 4, you must multiply the top. 1 times 4 is 4. And then we get to our last fraction, which is just fine. We did not have to change that. Now we want to add our numerators. 9 plus 4 is 13. 13 plus 5 is 18. So 18 is my numerator. 12 is my denominator. That is improper, so it needs to be reduced. 12 goes into 18 one time with 6 left over, and you put the 6 back over the 12. Now 6/12 is not fully reduced, so I need to reduce that. 6 goes into itself once, 6 goes into 12 2 times, and so my final answer will be 1 1/2. Let's look at the subtraction problem. 9 and 6, the common denominator there would be 18. If you don't see the 18, you could always multiply the 9 times the 6 and use 54, but you would just be working with larger numerators. Now, 9 goes into 18 2 times. If you multiply the bottom, you must multiply the top. So that is going to be renamed. 8/9 will become 16 over 18. And now we look at our second fraction. 6 goes into 18 3 times. 5 times 3 is 15. And 6 times 3, of course, is 18. And now, since we have common denominators, we can subtract those numerators. 16 minus 15 is 1/18. As you can see, this is a really easy concept, but we must remember the most important thing, and that is you must have a common denominator Oh, can I squeeze that in? Yes, you must have a common denominator to add or subtract fractions. Remember, this is different from my rules for multiplication and division. The denominators do not have to be the same, but they do have to be for addition and subtraction. Have a great day now, and do your math.